Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this webinar on using Gmail on the Horner OCS. So the presentation itself generally runs through variable-based setup of it, but we also have a handout attached today. So if you check the handout section, you will see there is a file on how to set up the Gmail security side of things to allow it to run again. We'll just jump straight into it, and you can just pop any questions at me at the end.
Welcome to today's tutorial. Let's get started. Let's have a look at our agenda for today. Today we're looking at using Gmail on the Horner OCS. We'll start by looking at some example email applications. We'll talk about Gmail security requirements for third-party apps, and we'll give the step-by-step procedure for generating an app password. Then we'll go through an example OCS email application so you can get some ideas about how you could integrate email capability into your next OCS project. Let's talk about some different email applications. Let's start by looking at using email to enunciate alarm conditions. So you can configure that when an alarm condition occurs, you not only can provide a notification on the screen that an operator can see, but you can also pre-configure text emails in Cscape with text describing a specific alarm and what needs to happen next. And you can do that in anticipation of when that alarm may actually occur as well. As well as that, you can embed live machine data in that email text. For example, if you have an oven and you have an over temperature condition that you want to enunciate, you can put text in the email that says you have an over temperature condition in the oven. But also you can embed real-time temperature data in the email so that when it's sent out, it could say the actual temperature at that time, which gives more information to those that are receiving the email. You can also use email capability to deliver file attachments on demand or on a schedule. So what are some examples of that? Some files that you may want to send from a machine to a person could be a data log of your process parameters, production reports, and quality reports. You could also use it to send batch data. For example, if you have a process where you're generating batches and every time a batch is complete, you could send a receipt type document via email to give all the details on the size of the batch and any other important information. You can also use email for preventative maintenance programs. For example, if you want to generate an email whenever a machine hits a certain milestone, such as a certain number of hours of operation or a certain number of machine cycles, when those conditions occur, you can send an email to notify you that says the machine has been running for 1000 hours, for example, or for a certain number of cycles, and that it's time to do some preventative maintenance on the machine. You may also want to generate an email whenever a particular parameter falls out of range, like a vibration parameter that you're monitoring or a temperature parameter. If those fall out of range, you can send an email again that flags that some maintenance is required on that machine. So as you can see, generating emails from an OCS when you're controlling the machine can offer some definitive advantages. Now let's talk about security requirements for Gmail. Gmail at the moment seems to be the dominant email client when it comes to machines sending emails. In May of 2022, Google stopped supporting the use of third-party apps that use only Google credentials to log in. Before that, you could log in with your Google email and Google password directly from an OCS or any other third-party app, and it would allow login and email operation. But as of May 2022, that does not work anymore, and that impacted Horner OCS customers and all other industrial devices that use Gmail for their email generation. However, Google did create a new procedure of generating an app password, which allows devices like Horner OCS to support Gmail once again. So we'll go through that process next. So here on this slide, we'll go through the steps required to generate an app password. The first thing you need to do, if you haven't done so already, is to create a Google account for the machine. If the machine already had a Google account, which therefore generated a Google email, then that step has already been completed. But once that step is complete, next you need to log into the Google account. From there, you need to go to the Manage Your Account section, then select Security, and then select two-step verification, and then set that up and follow that procedure to the end. Once that's done, you go back to the Security section once again, and this time you go into Select App Passwords. Under Mail, you'll find a list of devices that are available, and you select the last one, which is Other, and then you have the ability to assign a custom name that could be something like OCS 1234 or whatever you want to call it. After you've assigned a name, you now have the ability to generate a password. That password will be the one you input for the OCS when it's logging into the SMTP server for Google. There's two ways you can do that. You can hardcode the password, or if you assign a variable to the password, you can go into the OCS from the touchscreen in a protected screen you have set up and type in that new password from there. And then if it ever changes again in the future, you don't have to use Cscape to change the password. And then if it ever changes in the future, you won't have to use Cscape to make that change. Next, let's look at an example OCS email application in Cscape so you can get some ideas of some of the things you may want to integrate into your next application. Here's my application for this video. So let's start in Program, then Messaging, and then in this email area of Cscape. This is where we configure all the email type information and data for the application. The first thing we have to do is check this Enable Email Configuration checkbox. Now, email is a fairly complicated feature. We recommend that you take advantage of the status, and Cscape is asking for two 16-bit words of status. I've allocated a word array with a dimension of 2 to house that status information. Then, these are the different areas that require configuration for email. The first one is all the details in terms of your email server, where all the details for logging into Gmail need to be housed. Then down here we'll spend a brief amount of time looking at creating an email directory and outgoing messages. So let's begin with this email server configuration. There's two different approaches you can take when you're filling in the details for the server. One is that you don't check this checkbox and you can just hard code in everything for things like the server name, the email server, which you can hard code as smtp@gmail.com, the port number that you want to use for logging in, which is going to be 587 because that is the port number for TLS type security, and that's what's used in the OCS. Then for username and password, the username is going to be the Gmail email address for this machine, which you could just hard code in there, and then the password is that app password that you generated. So all of that could be hard coded and there's nothing wrong with that, except that if anything changes in the future, you'll have to use Cscape to make any changes. So what you can also do is assign variables to all of these things. To do that, I have to check this checkbox that says Get Settings from Registers. So I have assigned actual variables to all of these. The email address is just the Gmail address that I'm using for this machine, so I assigned that to a byte type array. I made that with a length of 32 characters. Then I point at the first character, which is obviously with an index of 0. Now if we're going to be accessing an SMTP server from a numeric IP address, then we can fill that numeric IP address in separately down here. But in our case, our address to access Gmail is smtp.gmail.com. So that is definitely going to require a DNS server to do that lookup for us. So we need to assign a variable here for the DNS server that we want to use to do that. So I almost always used h.h.h.h or h.h.4.4. So I assigned a variable here which is a regular 32-bit variable. And on the screen I have a place where I can type in that IP address format. Then this is the byte type array that's going to house our SMTP server name, which is going to be smtp.gmail.com. And then my SMTP port, that variable again is a 16-bit numeric port number, and it's going to house 587 as my port number. Then down here is my authentication for logging into the actual Gmail server. So my username in the case of Gmail is just the email address for that Gmail account. Then the SMTP password is going to be the app password that we generated. So that's what we need for logging into Gmail. Next, I'll show you some graphics we made on the screen to support this. So I'll go to Screens, and then I'll select the navigation finger here. So I just have a generic home screen with nothing on it except an email button. This is where I'm providing the user the ability to type in the IP address, netmask, and gateway for this particular OCS. This is where you input the DNS server address, so this will just contain 8.8.8.8 or something similar. And then here is where you'll type in from the keyboard smtp.gmail.com, and then the app password that you generated. And then this is where 587 is going to be inputted as the port number. Since that's quite a lot of typing, I've created some features to make it quicker. I've made a single button for loading defaults. For that, I have some ladder logic that is doing some string moves to move default information or default values into all these data fields just by pressing this button, which can save you some time. Another feature is that I also have a clear button next to every ASCII field, so that if you want to change it, you can start by just clearing it out. So let's continue onto the email address setup screen. This is where we're typing in the machine email address for the local OCS. Then I have some email addresses for the people that I want to send emails to from this OCS. I have created a maintenance category and a management category. And here's where I can input email addresses for each of those. Finally, I have a test screen that allows me to configure an email that I will send as a test. I have a button that allows me to trigger that. The way you do that is you turn on a bit to trigger an email. Then the OCS firmware, when it's done, will turn that bit off. So in this case, this trigger test email button is a toggle switch, not a momentary push button. And then this is that email status that I mentioned earlier, and I'm showing all the data that's available in that status register from all the individual potential errors. I also decoded the different states that the email engine could be in when one of these errors occurred. Then if we ever get some sort of error code back from the SMTP server, it would be contained in this feedback area here. So that's the information I have on the screen. Looking quickly at the ladder logic, this is just the logic for copying the defaults, clearing out individual data fields, extracting data from the system registers for the screen, and that sort of thing. The last thing I want to show you is just a quick look at creating email groups, as well as emails to send out. So going back to the email area here, I'll go into email directory. Here you can set up a whole series of groups that you may want to send emails to. Within those groups, you can assign one or multiple email addresses. In my case, here's the maintenance group I created, the management group I created, and the test group I created in this example. I just have one email address going to each of them, and I made these variables instead of hard coding them. If they were hard coded, you could hard code those addresses here. And then lastly, let's look quickly at the outgoing messages and how you can create them. For each outgoing message, you need to create a trigger bit, which is a Boolean variable that you're going to turn on in your application. That's going to trigger the email. Then the OCS firmware will turn that bit off again when it's done. Then when you configure the email that goes out, you can put a subject and a body of the email. I just put simple text in the body, but you can also embed live data fields, and you can also do file attachments, so it's very versatile in terms of the emails that you can create. So that's just a quick look at those elements of the email setup. So let's take a look at this running on the OCS. There's our LAN and email setup screen with everything filled in, including IP address, netmask, gateway, etc. You can see our SMTP server for Gmail as well as that app password that we generated. There's the DNS address so that the OCS can communicate with smtp.gmail.com because that's not strictly a numeric IP address. Our SMTP port number is 587 because we're using TLS security. You can see we have clear buttons and load default buttons for convenience when we're entering in the data. And you can also see that we have the ability to fill in the email address for the local machine and then for some recipients. I've just put in an email for both of those, and then we have a test screen here, which allows us to send a test email and to push a button to generate that test email. Let's do that now. And remember, we want to turn that bit on and let the firmware itself turn it off. And then we can also look at email status anytime we like. The OCS is in the process of generating the email that's being sent off to the SMTP server, and that process can take maybe up to a minute or so depending on how quickly everything happens. But when it's done, that trigger bit will turn off. And then I'll check my phone for the received email. You can see the button has turned off, which should indicate that we got the email. And there it is, and it's come in as we want it. That concludes our demonstration for today. Thank you for joining me for today's tutorial, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, just for those that joined slightly later, there is a handout this week if you want to check that section. It'll walk you straight through the setting up the app password on your Gmail account. And all you need to do then, as shown in the webinar, is put that app password into your Gmail setup that's already there, and you should be good to go again. Other than that, this is the last webinar before Christmas, so it'll be January again when we touch base on the new webinar. We'll have the list updated for January soon. Other than that, thank you for joining us this morning, and have a good day.